I don't really know how much background I need to give on who Whitey Bulger is for people who may not know as much about organized crime as maybe me and my brother do. He was basically the head of the Irish mob in Boston. He becomes kind of the leader of what's called the Winter Hill Gang, which is the Irish mob that kind of rivaled the Italian mob in Boston. And Whitey is kind of the boss of it. He becomes the boss in the late 70s, in 1978, and then continues to be the boss until the 1994, when he is indicted and he goes on the run. And he is on the run, and he's on the FBI most wanted list for 16 years before he's finally caught.
Well, he's actually goes on the run before,
or he goes
the
on the run.
indictments,
Yes,
came down, but he was basically tipped off, which we'll get into why. He had basically a very cozy relationship with members of law enforcement who were protecting him and his gang, and he was basically it was made known to him through his connections in law enforcement that indictments were about to come down, so at which time he fled. We should also just mention he became the sort of boss of the Irish mob in the Winter Hill Gang, because there were two warring factions. And why don't you speak to that a little bit?
We can talk about it. I want to bring up just mention, so the official story of his connection to the FBI.
Sure.
The official story is that it was only two corrupt FBI agents, which is John Connolly, who is Whitey Bulger's immediate FBI handler. If you're talking, Whitey Bulger was an informant, and he's giving information to the FBI
That's
about
what the government
mafia,
alleges.
is that John Connolly not only was his FBI informant, but was actually taking bribes from Whitey Bulger, and that John Morris, who is...
The government doesn't allege the bribes part.
No, it's... Well, no. It's part of it that he was giving money.
They're not referring to it as a bribe. They're saying it was part of a program.
But, yes. So that John Connolly was corrupt, and that his immediate supervisor, John Morris, was also corrupt, and that they both knew that Whitey was this evil, terrible person who was way more dangerous, at least into the 80s, than the Italian mafia was in Boston. But if you know anything about how top echelon informants work, or just how organized crime in general, it's very obvious that he had a lot more than just two FBI agents on his payroll.
It was sort of easy for the government, from my perspective, to throw the sort of guilt onto John Connolly, because it was an easy connection, because John Connolly and...
John Morris is the immediate supervisor.
Right, but John Connolly and Whitey Bulger actually grew up together in the same...
Yeah, so and we can go back now to just the beginning of Whitey Bulger's kind of criminal career, because that kind of ties into it. What's good about the book is that it goes really into detail about his rise to power. But it doesn't give a lot of detail to like his downfall, of how like he eventually did become to get indicted, of how like the jig was up apparently. I'm assuming that just either the FBI realized that they really couldn't keep this going any longer, and eventually came to the point where they had to indict him.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was pressure from other law enforcement agencies, because a lot of the other law enforcement agencies, like the Massachusetts State Police
were very pro getting Bulger and Bulger's right-hand man, who was Steve Fleming. They kind of ran the Winter Hell together. And when the indictments came, the agreement was that the Massachusetts State Police were going to arrest Stephen Fleming, and that the FBI were going to arrest Whitey Bulger. And a lot of people think that that's why Whitey Bulger was able to get away and Stephen Fleming wasn't, because the FBI were able to tip him off, while they couldn't do the same thing for Stephen Fleming because it's a different agency. So let's go back to So he's kind of a criminal his entire life. When he's in early teen in like the early 40s, he's kind of part of this street gang called it was called like the Leprechaun Crew, and it's basically like this gang of Irish
stereotypical
teenagers.
shit I've ever heard in my life.
It was the early 40s. It was called like the Leprechaun Gang or the Leprechaun Crew or something. Basically, teenage robbers and thieves and stuff.
They all kind of start out like that.
They all kind of start out like that. John Gotti very much started out like that.
Sammy Gravano, I was thinking.
Yes. And he leaves when he's 18 to go into the military. As like people say, it was like somewhat a vain attempt for him to get his life together. Mm-hmm. He doesn't, because in the military, there are several assaults. He ends up getting discharged for going AWOL, which is basically he left the military base without permission, and like that was the final straw that gets him kicked out.
Not very good with authority, this guy.
Yeah. And you see that when he becomes a criminal. He starts out he's robbing banks and hijacking trucks in the early 50s. He gets arrested in 1956 in federal prison. He's in Alcatraz. We mentioned on I keep bringing up the book Chaos because a lot of the things kind of come in to play with just corrupt FBI programs.
Wasn't there a rumor that he was part of one of the acid studies or something like that?
It's not a rumor. He was.
Okay. So why don't you just explain that a little bit for people who aren't familiar?
In the 1950s, in federal prisons, there was a CIA program called MK Ultra. And what MK Ultra was basically using LSD to experiment on people against their will. They were kind of trying to make like brainwashed assassins, of turning someone who would normally not be a hyper violent person to then go against their moral code, and you're basically creating a brainwashed assassin. So it is confirmed that Whitey Bulger was experimented on for this program. Whether that's what led to him becoming such a violent person later in life, I don't know. He has a history of assaulting people and robbing people before then.
Yeah, it's like he was kind of on track to be a gangster his whole life. I'm not sure. I mean, look, I'm sure it didn't help. Maybe it would explain some of the more gruesome aspects of what he was involved in, because a lot of people in the mafia are violent, but not to the extent that Bulger was. Some of them certainly are, like when you think of Roy DeMeo or something like that.
Yes.
But I mean, there's generally a rule. I don't know how strictly everybody follows it, but there's generally a rule in the mafia that you're not really going to kill women, and you're certainly not going to kill underage people, which he did both.
Yes.
So he's just a very, very sick individual. I'll be personally honest. Like Whitey Bulger, I love gangster history and stuff like that. I find it fascinating. As many people do, but there's something about when you cross that line and you start getting really dark. He's more, to me, he seems more like a serial killer. He was involved in like classic gangster rackets, whether it's loan sharking, drug dealing, gambling, things of that nature, extortion. But there's definitely a side where it's just goes into the depraved.
There are few. There are few, all gangsters are kind of like evil or bad people, but
Sure.
there are very few characters in the history of organized crime who really pass that level into the depraved. Of if they hadn't been groomed their entire life to be a gangster,
Right.
they probably would have ended up being a serial killer. And you brought up Roy DeMeo, who did cross that line, you read about Roy DeMeo or Whitey Bulger, and it does feel more like they are serial killers.
Right.
And with Roy DeMeo, of a lot of people who were in his gang, in his crew, ended up leaving because they were saying, I was afraid that if Roy DeMeo got bored enough, he would just kill me for the fun of it. And there's another thing about Roy DeMeo. I don't know if this is true about Whitey Bulger, but people would say that if he went too long without killing someone, he would kind of get anxiety. Of like he would kind of get like nervous and jumpy if like he had went too long without murdering someone.
Yeah, I mean that's like addict behavior.
Yes. Yeah. So we get back to he's in federal prison. These LSD experiments are done on him in the 50s. He gets out in 1965, and this is where you're talking about of this kind of Irish gang war that's going on in South Boston.
Yeah.
That he kind of uses to rise up. So the Winter Hill Gang, which is the gang that Whitey Bulger ends up becoming the boss of, was not at the time based in South Boston. It was based in Somerville. Mm-hmm. There are kind of two different groups that are fighting against each other. So there's the Keelan brothers, who they're two brothers. There's Donald and Kenny are these two Irish gangsters who are major loan sharks and run kind of gambling dens throughout South Boston. And then there's a group called the Mullen Gang.
Yep.
And the Mullen Gang is run by this guy, Donald McLaughlin, or maybe it's Donald McLaughlin. I believe Donald McGullen and Patrick Nee. And so the Mullen Gang and the Keelan Gang are fighting. And the Keelans, they like more see themselves as like business gangsters, like they're into loan sharking and more like not upscale, but more like serious crime. And you have it right there. McGonigal?
McGonigal.
Okay. So the Keelans hire.
No, sorry, that's Paulie.
Paulie McGonigal.
Keelan. It's Donald Keelan.
Donald Keelan.
Yeah.
So the Keelans kind of hire Whitey Bulger as their enforcers because they're tired of getting robbed by the Mullen Gang. So there is this war going on, and what happens is that the Winter Hill Gang from Somerville, they want to kind of get involved in the rackets of South Boston. So they align themselves with the Mullen Gang. And the Mullen Gang is really winning, and you feel like they're going to be the dominant force in South Boston. So Whitey Bulger makes a deal of he's going to take out his boss, Donald Keelan. And he says to Howie Winter, the head of Winter Hill, he says, I can run the Keelan Gang better than they can. You let me take them out and take over their rackets. I'll make peace with the Mullins, and then we'll both work for you. So that's what happens is he kills Donald Keelan, and then Kenny Keelan, the younger brother, he kind of just chases out of town. He's saying, like, you're done in this business, and if you come back here, I'm going to kill you. So now the major loan sharking and gambling is controlled by Whitey Bulger. And the Mullen Gang that's still kind of associated with the Winter Hill Gang, they're not really into loan sharking, or more like crimes where you have a pretty standard income of every week, you know how much you're going to make. They
call that the peanut butter and jelly of the mafia,
yeah.
The gambling and loan sharking.
Yeah. The Mullen Gang isn't into that. They're more of like a stick-up crew. Like they're a group of thieves and robbers, and that's what they do. So Whitey sees this and says, hey, you're making more money with me than you are with the Mullins. Just let me take out those guys, and then I'll just be your guy in South Boston.
Right.
So you see his way of kind of finessing of first he takes out his boss, and then he convinces Howie Winter, who's kind of the major Irish crime figure, to let him take out his rivals. And now Whitey Bulger is the main kind of boss of South Boston.